What do you think? Should a title get our attention? Should it entice us to read more? Should a title be meaningful? Or should it be something that stands the test of time? According to the book Poetry, A Writer's Guide and Anthology, edited by W. Todd Kanko and Amora Cui, a title should do all four of those things. We know the title is the name of the poem, but what is the aim of a poem's title? How do we establish what it should be? Are there techniques we could use? Are there different types of poem titles? These are great questions to be asking, poet, and in this week's episode, we are going to tackle them all. I want you to imagine a reader browsing a table of contents for a literary journal or for an anthology. The titles in that book are the first indication of what a poem might be up to and whether or not the reader will find it interesting. You want to find a successful title that's going to engage your reader's intellectual and emotional curiosity. You want to find something that's going to stick its hooks in them and get them ready to read the poem. Maybe the best titles are themselves lines of poetry. Maybe the best titles are extremely simple or one-word titles even. In this week's episode, we're going to ask all the hard questions about how to create attention-grabbing, enticing, meaningful titles that will stand the test of time. Welcome to the Poetry Lab podcast. The Poetry Lab started 11 years ago to help dedicated, self-taught, and formally trained writers find a place in their community to write, read, learn, and collaborate. We help writers tap into their craft with radical self-compassion, unlike anything you've ever seen in a creative writing classroom before. If you're a creative person trying to establish a writing practice in the real world, this podcast is designed to help you carve out the time, the courage, and the inspiration to keep writing your new shit. Are you ready, poet? Let's get into it. Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the Poetry Lab podcast. I'm Danielle, and I'm really excited to tackle this question because titles can be so challenging when they just don't naturally come to us. You know that feeling when you're just unsettled because a poem hasn't found its title? I do, and it's probably my least favorite battle to wage in revision. Sometimes titles just come to us even before a poem does, and that feeling is delicious. But other times, they're not there, and we have to hunt around for them. Today, we're going to explore 5 different strategies to help you create titles for your poems. These are not hard and fast rules, but they're great starting points. I'd say they also are great at helping us understand things we've already been doing by instinct for a long time. We'll get to talk about how different poets use their titles with lots of great examples. Before we jump in, I want to give a big shout out to Poetry Lab fellow Bridgette Kreiner, whose article in the Resource Center, Making It Work, 5 Jobs for Poem Titles, was the original inspiration for this podcast episode. I'm going to link to Bridgette's article in the show notes because I really want you to go check it out even after you listen to this episode. I've added to Bridgette's examples with a lot of my own titles. And so we have a very long list of all the poems and poets and books that we mentioned in this episode. But if you go read the article, you'll get even more. You can find it at thepoetrylab.com/resource, and you can find the show notes for this episode, episode 35, at thepoetrylab.com/podcast. One of my favorite poem titling tactics is providing your reader the grounding factors of time, place, or location. Bridgette calls this locating poems. And a great example would be James Wright's poem called Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. Incredibly specific, right? And I'm sure you've heard this poem before. It's the short poem that ends, "And I have wasted my life." Just from the title, we know exactly where we are and what we're doing. lying in a hammock at William Duffy's farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. We even have the added character of William Duffy, whoever the hell that is. We can visualize a setting even before we read the first word. Locating titles work because they set the stage. They help your reader slip into the world of the poem without getting lost. I find locating titles especially helpful when what takes place in the poem is surreal or ambiguous. The grounding title gives the reader a foothold before the earth gets shaky. So some more examples of locating titles are Ross Gay's Pulled Over in Short Hills, New Jersey, 8 a.m. Also, Tiana Clark's Nashville. Maybe my all-time favorite locating title is The City in Which I Love You by Lee Young Lee. Notice how locating titles can be very specific, but some are less so. Lee Young Lee does not name the city, and yet for the next 6.5 pages, its descriptions are luminous. And when in the city in which I love you, even my most excellent song goes unanswered, the poem begins. And I mount the scab streets, the long shouts of avenues, and tunnel-sunken night in search of you. Now the question is not just what a locating title can do, but when to use one. I see a few different opportunities for you here. As I mentioned, when a poem's content is abstract or surreal, giving a clear time or place offers a concrete point of reference that allows your reader to navigate the poem's more elusive themes without feeling lost. Another way to use a locating title is when you want to create a specific emotional or cultural context. Sometimes a location carries an emotional weight. It deepens the reader's understanding of the poem even before they begin reading. Mentioning a particular city, country, or historical moment can evoke certain associations or feelings. For instance, setting your poem in Paris, 1940, or My Childhood Home, can immediately give the poem an emotional resonance and inform the reader's perspective. This morning I was reading Loudest When Startled by Luna Ray Hall. One of the opening poems of that book is called Topography of a Family Farm circa age 9. It's a perfect example of a locating title and one I found accidentally just this morning. I'm going to link to all the books, all the poems, and all the poets I mentioned today in this episode on the show notes page for episode 35 of the Poetry Lab podcast. Next, let's talk about titles that signal a specific poetic form. We often see this for sestinas and ghazals. I know we can all appreciate it too. More than once, I've been in a class or a book club contemplating hidden forms in a book of poetry. Hidden only in the sense that they are not named in the title. Sometimes a title will directly name the form, as in A.E. Stallings' poem, Sestina, Like. In that poem, the word like is both part of the title and the word that repeats throughout the sestina, hinting at how the form and content will intertwine for the reader. This approach lets your reader know upfront that they'll be reading a formal poem, which can shift their expectations about how the language will behave. Another example is R.A. Villanueva's Sonnet 146, which both nods to the sonnet form and pays tribute to Shakespeare, whose sonnets are numbered in a similar way. Other times, poems are not directing the reader to a specific form, but a mode for poetry, such as Patrick Rosal's Crew Love Elegy. Poems like this announce to the reader that they are in the mode of a nocturne or aubade. Maybe they're even an essay, like Samita Chakravorty's Essay on Thunder from her book Arrow. When we set the mode or form for the reader in the title, we're providing them with some comfort. Maybe we're also giving ourselves a little relief too. It's nice to be able to put a stamp on a poem knowing it's the right thing. They even sometimes feel like mile markers. When I look through a table of contents of poems that I've written and I see pantoums, sestinas, and sonnets, I feel rewarded by the fact that I've done the work to write in all these different forms. I especially like unexpected combinations of titles. such as Brendan Constantine's Nocturne that is just titled Noct. Even from my own work, I have a Google Ghazal, which felt to me like an unfamiliar pairing of pop culture and form. Another reason you might signal a poetic form in your title is to create a connection to literary traditions. Naming a poetic form allows the poet to engage with or pay homage to those traditions. It makes us feel connected to the grander scheme of things. And I think as writers, we like that feeling. But once again, points for turning that tradition on its head, such as Terence Hayes does with The American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. Another powerful tool is the alluding title. This type of title can reference another work of literature, a historical figure, or even a pop culture event, which can add layers of meaning to your poem. Take Amakajo's poem, 13 Ways of Looking. It references Wallace Stevens' famous poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. The title gives readers a little nudge saying, hey, if you know that Stevens poem, you'll get a little bit more out of this. Allusions are like Easter eggs for your readers, rewarding them with deeper connections if they're familiar with the references. I love a good Easter egg. Just remember that not all references are universal. So maybe you give an epigraph on the poem between the title and the first line that gives a little more context, maybe illuminating for your reader what that Easter egg is. Or you use a footnote after it's done. Don't assume that all of your allusions will be universal. Similar effects can be made when we reference or reappropriate something from another sector of society. We see this in Natalie Diaz's poem Orange Alert and Morgan Parker's Miss Black America. Referencing titles have a few functions. They create layered meaning. Allusions and titles invite readers to engage with your poem on multiple levels, especially if they are familiar with that reference. But again, buyer beware. Are they familiar with your reference source? When you use an allusion, you always take the risk that the reference could be missed or largely unknown to your readers. Your referencing title may also set an expectation. It can guide the reader's mindset before they start the poem. One way to subvert that is to reinterpret or challenge the original work that you're referencing. This could create some interesting tension in your work. And you all know I love some good tension. At times, the simplest titles are the most effective. Titles that name the speaker, subject, or object of the poem can be incredibly direct, but they also offer clarity. Take, for example, the Camille Dungy poem From the Unwritten Letters of Joseph Freeman. The title names the speaker of the poem, giving us insight into who is voicing the words. For persona poetry, this tactic is especially useful. It establishes the identity up front. It allows the readers to accept the narrative perspective right away, and it avoids confusion. It lets the language take over. There are other great uses of this tactic as well. I love the poem in which framework. Sometimes poem in which can be dropped from the title after you've used it as a formula to create a subject or object-based title. It's essentially poem in which this thing happens to this other thing, or poem in which this really great thing gets closely examined. For example, Ross Gay's A Poem in Which I Try to Express My Glee at the Music My Friend Has Given Me. Or Chelsea Wagner's Poem in Which Elephants Are Stupendous. I'll link to both of them in the show notes. This technique balances specificity and authenticity. It's flexible enough to allow poets to introduce nearly any subject, event, or emotion while maintaining a sense of formality and structure. This frame can be used for personal, observational, or narrative poems while still leaving a space for creative exploration. I like how it names the subject or object, but also leaves the details of how that subject will be treated to the poem itself. It doesn't over-explain, but it sets us up, almost like a volley. In this way, the title acts as a guide and a teaser. It orients the reader without giving away the full experience of the poem. Heading into our last topic, I have a little story for you. When I was an undergraduate in my Poetry 3 workshop, which was a million years ago in 2008, we didn't know what to call this technique, where a title begins a thought that's finished in the first line of the poem. Memorably, one of my classmates was trying to remember the word caesura, but instead called it a skizzle. From then on and forever, it's been a skizzle to me. You know this technique. It's evident in poems like You Could Never Take a Car to Greenland by Maggie Smith. The poem opens like this. You could never take a car to Greenland, my daughter says, unless the car could float, unless by car you mean boat, unless the ocean turned to ice and promised not to crack, unless Greenland floated over here, having lifted its anchor, unless we could row our country there, our whole continent would have to come along, wouldn't it? This technique blurs the line between the title and the poem's body, creating a seamless flow. Another famous example is William Carlos Williams' poem, This Is Just to Say, which leads directly into the poem's first line, I have eaten. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, right? Using this approach makes your title part of the poem's rhythm and pacing. The title and the first line work together to create a cohesive thought, and it can pull us straight into the tension of the poem, leaving no gap in the poem's bottomless funnel. Prose poems are especially exciting when they do this. I encourage you to check out Since I Quit That Internet Service by Taylor Johnson from their book Inheritance. Using this technique for prose poetry, the poet capitalizes the title of the poem and incorporates it straight into the sentence and into the text block. So the title and the first sentence become, Since I quit that internet service, I'm thinking more about the transitive properties in books. This is also seen in some of Don Lundy Martin's prose poems, such as I call for my stranger, I long for him, from Good Stock, Strange Blood. This title is incorporated into the prose block and also the first complete sentence of the poem. I'm seeing this technique used more and more often, and I'm very excited by it. I love the way in which these poems don't announce themselves. They just dive in without preamble. It's pretty cool. Before I leave you today, I want to give you a prompt, an exercise really, about how to come up with poem titles. We've gone over 5 techniques for titling your poems, which again, you can review by going to Making Titles Work, 5 Jobs for Poem Titles, the article that Bridgette wrote in our resource center. We talked about locating titles, titles that signal a poetic form, titles that allude to or refer to something already known by the reader, titles that name the speaker, subject, or object, and titles that begin a thought. But I have an exercise for finding your poem title when you're struggling to get there. This method was taught to me through the mentorship of Shira Erlichman. A few years ago, I was working with Shira one-on-one doing some editorial stuff, and she helped me with this tactic for sourcing titles. The first was to treat your title like a newspaper headline. As you know, in journalism, the headline tells all the pertinent information of the article. The lead paragraph also tells all the important information. From that lead paragraph on down, the importance or urgency of the information gets less and less. If you were to summarize your poem as if it were a headline with all the important information in it, what would that title be? For a poem I was working on, Shira suggested that the headline was Young Woman Finds Love of Shoes to Horrific Ends, which was a very accurate summarization of that poem. She assigned me the task of creating a few other headlines to see how else we would headline the poem. What other actions were happening? Who are the characters? What is the moment? Where's the location? Looking into its language, we could also source another title. Were there any lines that we could pull to the top? One of my lines was, Here is a Waltz. Shira really liked that one and suggested it was a possible title for the piece. Another option was to see what the poem evoked or what's not in the text that could be added at the top for more context. So some titles like Stiletto or even Date Night were added to our list. We collected up all of these titles, the headlines, the source text, and the additional context titles into a list so then we could look at it. In the end, I ended up using a combination of tactics, something like the second technique we talked about today, where I signaled the poetic mode in the title, but I also came to the word stiletto through our hunt through the text and context for words and clues. The final result was Praise Song for the Stiletto. And since it's been published by Drunk Monkey's Journal, I'm excited that I get to link to it in the show notes. You can go over, give it a read, and see if there's another title you see hiding in that piece. But it was definitely one of the most challenging poems I have ever had to place a title on. The point is, I would never have arrived at it without the project of hunting for it. And there is absolutely no shame in not having a title just magically come to you. It is okay if hunting for a title is part of your revision process. It's a perfectly natural step to take. In fact, I would say if your poems title themselves really easily, take a second look. Is it a working title? Is it a placeholder? Is there something better you could title your poem? It's always worth considering this as part of your revision process. And just as Shira showed me a technique for sourcing a poem's title, I want you to use this entire podcast episode as your exercise for finding your poem's title. So look for the headline, search through your source text, look for additional context clues, and consider all the techniques that we looked at today. Should you have an alluding title? Should you name the form or point to the poetic mode in your title? Should you use a locating title? Consider everything we've just talked about in your hunt for your poem's title. Well, we've come to the end of the episode, my friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Poetry Lab podcast. This really is a labor of love, and we're having a great time making it for you. If you like this episode, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening now. It also really helps if you send the link to a few creative friends and let them know what we're doing here at the Poetry Lab. I'm Danielle. You can catch up with me at Imaginary Danny on Instagram or in one of our classes at thepoetrylab.com. Good luck with your poem titles. I can't wait to read more of your work out in the world, poet. That's all for now. I hope to see you soon at the Poetry Lab.